A very brief agenda. I'm going to start off with discussing the uncertainties and modeling assumptions that we use in the outlook, as we always do. This is really a synopsis of all these stakeholder calls. What are people telling me that they're thinking, and how are we formulating those thoughts into the outlook? We're going to then move to the different parts of the value chain. And then once we move through the value chain, we'll then have Tyler and Garrett walk through those federal and state policies and give some perspective on that. And then, as always, we will conclude with our employment forecasts. So if you have any questions at any time during the webinar, please type them in the Q&A on Zoom, and we're going to leave time at the end for answers. As you consider asking questions, please do keep in mind that the webinar is recorded and that so it'll be available online after. I will do my best to take all the questions and kind of summarize them and then give them to the panel. So again, ask them at any time. There are also many more slides, actually about double the amount of slides we're going to show today are on the website, as well as the full report, and the link is in the chat. So please go check that out as well and be willing, and you're happy to share it with whoever you'd like. So it's public. So with that, let's move into the intro and uncertainties. So the biggest topic of discussion this year was really policy uncertainty. And again, we're going to have Tyler and Garrett dig into this later, but I'm going to kind of tee up, kind of what some of these phone conversations were. So of course we had offshore leasing. Today we have the offshore lease sale in New Orleans. It was a wonderful event in New Orleans yesterday. I was able to attend on this. And really the key discussion there, and it's really been hearing from many of our industry partners, is the uncertainty that's been added to the offshore leasing process. Of course, when the Biden administration came in, as we've covered in previous years' Energy Outlook, he had the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It discontinued offshore permitting while a comprehensive review was put in place. There was, of course, legal challenges that we've discussed about in prior years. Then we talked about the Inflation Reduction Act that was the negotiation to continue offshore leasing. But some of our industry partners were still critical of this, saying not all of you provided uncertainty, but also the leasing wasn't moved forward. It's the clip that they would have liked. Of course, the Trump administration has come in and has really accelerated this offshore leasing for oil and gas. But at the same time, some of our wind colleagues and really offshore operator colleagues who are also doing oil and gas historically and are now interested in doing wind as well have noted that the Trump administration issued the January 20th memorandum temporarily withdrawing all U.S. OCS areas from offshore wind leasing and freezing new or renewed federal approvals of wind projects. And so one of the discussions is, are we going to start seeing when new administrations come in this back and forth, and how does that impact investments that persist a long time? The other big example was, of course, LNG export policy. Biden administration paused LNG export approvals following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the need for that natural gas, especially in Europe for the geopolitical purposes. These were resumed, and now the Trump administration has really been fast tracking these. But it's just another example of the shift in policy at the federal level impacting these investments. Tariff policy, and I'm going to talk about that. It's the second bullet point here, has also created this uncertainty. And then the other big one was tax credits. So we had the Inflation Reduction Act, had tax credits. Some of those tax credits were discontinued under the One Big Beautiful Bill Act prematurely. And that was really, for talking with people that have followed this a long time, is really unprecedented. When tax credits expired, it was common to perhaps not continue them, but to discontinue them within law early was really another uncertainty. And so GCEO has incorporated this new section that we've talked about based upon this policy uncertainty. So this year, we're going to continue to assume that the current federal framework continues through the forecast horizon, which is always the case. We don't forecast ever in our energy outlooks. Never do we consider policies that might change. We always use the current policy regime as the baseline moving forward. But we do not know that this policy uncertainty has created, this uncertainty has negatively impacted some of the investments and a lot of the companies that we've talked to. And so this was really the key theme of this year. So the second piece of that is international trade and tariffs. For those of you who followed the outlook for many years, you know that this is something we followed closely. This is just a brief timeline of this year, but we had in March, we had the 25% tariff was imposed on any country importing Venezuelan oil. You had Liberation Day in April, and then we kind of move through. I'm not going to talk through each one of these pieces of it, but through the uncertainty of the implementation of the tariffs, these individual trade negotiations, which on the slide deck online, I'm not going to cover it here right now in the presentation, but we have some of the individual countries and some of the breakdowns of those. And right now, of course, we're waiting for the Supreme Court decision on IEPA to see, well, does the federal government really have the authority, or I guess does the executive branch have the authority to put these tariffs without the actions of Congress? And so all of these uncertainties again are impacting investment here in the Gulf Coast region. And so, there are really two margins for which we think about these. One is that what an economist refers to as the intensive margin. So in the short run, companies are going to shift where goods are produced and sold. And what is this going to do? Of course, it's going to raise costs, not only from the tariffs themselves, but also the higher logistics and compliance and transportation caused by these trade disruptions. And I remember the day after Liberation Day, I was giving a presentation in a community here in the river corridor. And at the presentation, there were I counted about 10 companies that were, of course, chemical firms that had operations in over 100 countries. And I was able to ask them, like, how are you dealing with this? And that was kind of the answer they gave of, well, in the short run, we're really going to pause all of our, really forward-looking investments, and we're really going to focus on shifting this intensive margin of how are we going to shift production across these different facilities we have all over the world in response to these tariffs. So that's really the first effect that it had. The second is this extensive margin. So now we're thinking about the uncertainty on capital investment. And so it can delay capital investment if there's uncertainty, but it can also influence where that capital investment is going to occur. And so if there are tariffs in the future, perhaps it could have some capital investment happen in countries that it wouldn't have happened otherwise. And of course, that is the goal of the tariff policy, is to really to bring back this manufacturing to the United States. But it also, again, influences the timing of the capital investment, that if there's uncertainty about the policy persistence of that, perhaps companies are slower making that capital investment. So the effect on that extensive margin is a bit ambiguous and is something that we're going to be really, really watching closely as some of this uncertainty continues to unfold. So we're going to assume that the current tariff policy regime remain in place. Again, we don't assume that there are changes to policy until they happen, but we do note that it's made it more difficult to find international buyers for products due to potential reciprocal tariffs, and also higher input costs, especially for these capital projects, are two things that companies specifically have cited to us. The third is the economic outlook. So let's talk about what the economic outlook. So this is U.S. employment. And as you can see, the 1990s, we had the economic growth, the 2001 recession. Then we had growth before the Great Recession in 2009, the financial crisis. We had a long period of economic growth after that, then the pandemic. And today, the U.S. economy is estimated has about 4.8% more employment than before the pandemic. So we've really rebounded post that pandemic peak. But you notice here, and this is a quib I've shown in prior years, is the stock market has predicted 9 of the last 5 recessions. It's kind of a joke, but there are two points here. As you can see, a few years ago, where you had the stock market, and then you had this most recent adjustment here earlier this year. But of course, employment's continued to expand, and the stock market has recovered. So let's dive into those really briefly here. So when you look at, 2021, 22, and into early 2023, what you had was this inflation was really escalating. And we entered this time period where inflation was outpacing wage growth. And at the time, we had said in our energy outlook, well, if inflation continues to outpace wage growth, this is going to have to put us into a business cycle recession. So we're going to contract business cycle contraction, or is commonly referred to as a recession. The other option is that wage growth will start to outpace inflation, in which case we could have this soft landing, if you will. And that fortunately is exactly what we've seen. So today, average hour earnings growth is outpacing inflation. And the difference between this is similar enough to the difference in the pandemic time period. And so kind of the fundamentals here are positive. And then, of course, you add in quarter one of this year, we had the news of negative real GDP growth out of the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Of course, it's hard to have causal why would this was the case, but it's reasonable to think that the tariff uncertainty of putting those shocks into the price signals throughout the economy led to a little bit of a slowdown there in Q1. We've now picked up, and now Q2, we have our current estimate is robust economic growth. So again, while we had those uncertainties, and we had that, that quarter one, which was not very good, Q2 was very, very robust growth, at least the current estimates now from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so for our outlook, we're going to assume again that the economic outlook is strong. Okay. And so we can see this translating into world final energy consumption. Energy demand globally is forecasted to grow, is to grow at a robust clip, and we're going to talk more about that. But ultimately, we really view our outlook as being driven by this international demand growth, which is going to continue into the coming decades, which ultimately is going to spur a lot of the investment that we're going to talk about today. And you can see that here of really putting that into perspective, this relationship between GDP per capita and energy consumption. And as these countries continue to move up that line, they're going to increase their energy demand, which is going to lead to increases in, of course, the production of that energy around the world, which the Gulf Coast is really ground zero for that. Okay. And this just shows that we're a net exporter to the world, while the U.S. is a net importer, and why this is so important. So this year's GCO, we're going to assume that the U.S. will continue to experience economic growth and demand for energy globally will continue to rise. And much like past years, we really are focusing on that long run demand growth. It's the fundamentals of being strong for the energy sector here in the Gulf Coast region. And finally, electric demand growth. So, everywhere I go, people are talking about energy demand growth, energy demand growth, energy demand growth. And that's absolutely true. And I showed it a moment ago. But if you look at the U.S. energy demand growth, we actually haven't seen growth here in a decade. In fact, we've had flat in terms of the total BTUs of energy. And in fact, the EIA is projecting U.S. energy demand to decline a little bit in the coming years. The World Energy Agency is actually the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Agency is actually forecasting a little bit of an increase in energy demand in the U.S. So we're going to kind of be agnostic, and for our purposes, we're going to assume that total energy demand is flat in the U.S., but that again, that international demand growth. But one of the things that I think is going to happen in the U.S. and is a theme of this year's outlook is the share of that energy coming from electricity. And this really shows that in terms of the age of electrification. We've got electric vehicles and heat pumps that actually end up needing less energy, total energy to drive a mile in an electric vehicle, or less total energy to do the same heating from a heat pump than natural gas, but the amount of electricity is more. And so as we start seeing more electrification, this can actually lead to efficiencies of reductions in the total BTUs of energy needed, but increased shares from the electricity sector. And then, of course, data centers is the big one. And so we put that into perspective. We looked at EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, their high growth scenario for data centers, the International Energy Agency, Goldman Sachs, McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and you can see there are really wide estimates of the total amount of electricity that could be needed from these data centers. And so that's really a big one that we think will drive electricity demand growth. But again, when you put it into perspective of total BTUs of energy, could it increase a little bit? I'm sure that could definitely occur, but it's really that electrification that is the big topic of discussion this past year. Okay. And so GCO continues to assume, again, that total BTU consumption will remain flat. We're kind of agnostic to whether that goes up or down a little bit, depending upon what you believe. But what is important is that the electricity share will increase, and availability of affordable electricity is increasingly cited as a reason for the project location and choice. And the metadata center here in Louisiana is a big one. And in the Energy Outlook itself, that's on the website, we have more on comparisons of data centers in Texas and Louisiana, for instance. We're not going to cover that today, but you can go check that out. And with that, I'm going to pull Garrett here for just a second to talk about some of the work that he's been doing with data centers for a minute before we hop into the data center, or sorry, into the energy supply chain. So, Garrett, if you want to make a few comments on the work y'all are doing on AI and demand growth.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Upton. And I just want to double tap on a comment that he made for folks that aren't neck deep in the energy industry. So the looking at a larger percentage of energy going toward electrification. And of course, data centers is one component of that, but there are a lot of other electrification components, including electric vehicles that are projected to consume a larger percentage of overall electricity. But what's happening is that you are now seeing a significant change in the energy industry driven by this increase in electricity demand from data centers. So many people use things like Waze maps and Google apps and things along those lines that have an entire backbone tied to these data centers to process the data to kick out information that provides hopefully more convenient answers and solutions for the average American. It is projected that with this massive infusion of hundreds of billions of dollars in the United States, as Dr. Upton noted, you are going to see these data centers located in places that have abundant energy, that have the ability to put electricity in places where you can maintain reliability and price affordability, which means that, as indicated by the Meta Center located in North Louisiana, that Louisiana is going to be an attractive source. But again, just in closing, we are seeing hundreds of billions of dollars infused into data centers into the United States. We're working with a new coalition that is everything from the financiers, the hyperscalers, the technologists, on through to the engineers, contractors, and utilities. So literally the entire AI stack in the United States. This administration has made this a high priority, looking at this sort of like a Cold War between the United States and China, and that there will not be a second place, and you will have one country prevail. So massive investments and administration priority, and seeing dirt turning and projects like what could be the largest data center in the world, if not the Western Hemisphere, right in Louisiana.
Fascinating, Garrett. Thanks. It's just incredible to see the intersection of energy demand increasingly and those geopolitics. All right. So next, we're now going to move to oil and gas production. So, Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Craig. So, U.S. Oil and gas production has continued to increase since the upset of the pandemic. If you go back to 2009, it's really been a pretty steady increase of both oil and gas, and those can be tied to the advent of the dual technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, which have driven production in the U.S. since that advent. Global production has been on a relatively steady increase for the last 40 years, but you can see with the advent of the increase in production in the U.S., it's captured a growing percentage of the world market, now accounting for 16% of global production, coming from the increasing U.S. production. Locally, the Haynesville appears to have peaked in the 2022-2023 range at about 14 BCF per day, but it's settled down to about 12 BCF a day, and is still a significant contributor, especially to the LNG export markets. The rig count has reliably followed changes in price for the past 20 so years, or 15 of the last 20 years. It appears that it's separated there at about 2021, and that might initially indicate kind of a negative economic indicator. But in fact, if you take into account that production has been increasing during that time period, the lower rig count is really just an indication of increases in technology, with fewer rigs allowing for more production. And we had some pretty significant examples in 2025 in the Deepwater Gulf, and at a water depth of 5,800 feet, a floating production system hit a target production rate of 100,000 barrels per day from 4 wells. The reservoir depth was at 30,000 feet. And what was significant was they were able to utilize 20,000 PSI drilling and production systems. So this is technology that's being developed over the past year or two. Also, as Greg mentioned, the federal lease sale is today. That's the first time since December of 2023. That sale saw $382 million in high bids. You might expect this year to be a little better because during that 2-year period where there were no sales, several more leases expired, so there are actually more leases available. And then in the Haynesville formation, there was a record set with a well with a total depth, measured depth of 32,000 feet and a lateral length of 20,000 feet. And that well is currently producing 80 million cubic feet per day. So significant advances in technology are accounting for significant increases in a per well production rate, which is why production is continuing to go up even as rig counts fall off. The rig counts are entirely driven by the primary resource play producing regions, the Permian being the most significant of those, but the relative share has remained fairly constant for the last 10 years or so. Prices can be broken up into historical epochs. What's represented here are the West Texas Intermediate oil prices and the Henry Hub natural gas prices. The dark lines are the median values for each epoch, and the two lighter lines are the one standard deviation above and below. Significant over the last 2 years. In 2022, 23, it appeared that maybe the effect of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the upset of natural gas markets there had maybe pushed us into a new epoch, but markets recovered pretty significantly, and we're now back actually toward the lower end of the price range for the epochs for both oil and gas over that time period. Prices are projected to be fairly flat into the foreseeable future. Our projections have shifted up and down a little bit, but $60 a barrel looks like it's the future for quite a while, and something between $3 or $4 per MMBTU for natural gas. You would note that the color codes indicate the 3 successive years of forecasting. Oil has tended to go up a little bit, while natural gas has tended to trend down a little bit in the forecast prices. This is our this year's production oil production forecast. If you were to compare it to last year's, you see that it's a little less optimistic, and that's in part because last year we used the Enverus model, which is still fairly aggressive, pointing to a production rate of 15 million barrels a day by 2032. This is based on the annual energy outlook from Energy and Information Administration. So a little less optimistic, in fact, indicating decreasing production forecasts going forward. But this works better with our overall model structure. So we've shifted over to the AEO forecast model.
Yeah, and on a note, Enverus has discontinued the old version of the Prodcast model, which has also shifted us to the AEO.
Natural gas is also a little less optimistic this year than last year in the Gulf Coast Energy Outlook forecast because of that same change, but it is in both cases projected to increase into the foreseeable future.
And with that, we'll move very quickly into midstream. So one of the things that we look at is the share of oil that's moving from the Mid-Continent down to the Gulf Coast by pipeline. And when you have a lot of that coming from rail and tanker, what that tells you is that there are bottlenecks within the pipeline system. And that closely correlates with the price difference between WTI and LLS. And so these are in healthy balance right now. So our midstream, at least our oil component of it, and moving crude oil from the Mid-Continent down to the Gulf Coast is, remains in a healthy place. We do have, by the way, on the website, some data on the pipeline expansions that are happening. And so that data can be found on the website, but it's keeping up well with the oil production increase. Then we got Brent WTI. This is international versus the US. So as you can see, we have Brent, which is trading at a little bit higher price, and also the futures are higher price here in the United States, which is facilitating giving a comparative advantage not only to the oil production here, but also to the refined products that we'll talk about here in a little bit. So this is our oil being less expensive than that global market is a competitive advantage whenever we're looking at expansions. And then the other one we look at for midstream is natural gas. And this is a big one, especially for the LNG export that we'll talk about here in a minute. But we have Henry Hub, TTF, which is the tidal transfer facility in Europe, as well as the JKM, which is the Japan Korean marker. And as you can see, that European and Asian prices are really, really similar and move together really closely. But again, the US, the Henry Hub, has that competitive advantage in terms of that lower price, which is again a comparative advantage for us as we think about the expansion of our energy sector. And so again, we got more slides with midstream online, but those are the high points for the outlook. And so with that, we're now going to move to Andrew, who's going to talk about the power sector.
Thanks, Greg. So start with a few charts. This first chart depicts total U.S. electricity sales versus the four Gulf states. And just a reminder, those states are Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. There's two distinct trends. The first is through the 2008-2009 financial crisis. You see modest growth in the U.S. You see from 2009, though, the last 15 or so years, a flat line. What's also depicted, though, that's important is the relative share of the Gulf Coast. And you see from 2009 through 2025, what's depicted is growing. It's growing relative to a flat story nationally. Now, when you dig deeper, there are some things that are driving that, which we'll get to here in this next slide. So looking at industrial sales, again, over the time frame, this is 30 plus years, sales are flat. But that doesn't tell the full story. If you look at the yellow line, which is a depiction of the Gulf Coast share, which is the lighter shaded color at the bottom, you see significant growth from around 16, 17% 15 years ago to closer to 25% today. If you look across the US, industrial sales of electricity have actually declined. Some states have lost more than half of their industrial electricity sales in just the last 20 years. I've mentioned this one before to Greg. Maryland, to me, is the most extreme example where their industrial electricity sales have declined more than 80% relative to 2004. On the other hand, states like Louisiana and Texas, along with a few others, North Dakota, New Mexico, Oklahoma, again, a common denominator is natural gas, energy infrastructure. All of those states have seen significant industrial expansions driving sales growth. For Louisiana, sectors like LNG exports and petrochemicals both come to mind. There's an emerging story, though, and that is data centers. Yeah, go ahead, Greg. So over the last 2 years, with the emergence of AI, hyperscale cloud operations, what Garrett mentioned at the start of this, you have seen a massive new data centers being proposed and constructed. A few years ago, a large-scale data center would have been 50 to 100 megawatts, which is very large for what looks like a warehouse from the outside. However, today, the largest data centers being planned are at least an order of magnitude, if not larger. The example depicted here is one that I think everyone that's on the call, at least if you're from Louisiana, should have some familiarity with. That is the Meta Hyperion Data Center campus in Richland Parish in the northern part of the state that is being constructed. That's a 4 million plus square feet facility and requires more than 2,000 megawatts of power. That's unprecedented. That requires the utility, Entergy Louisiana, my former employer, to invest in both generation and transmission to serve that. And at least according to the Louisiana Economic Development Agency, there are some additional hyperscale data center facilities that are being considered for Louisiana. We get to the next one. Let's talk about the changing generation mix. It's a little difficult to visualize just this last 10 years what's happening. But if you go back a little further and start with coal, the bottom of the chart, coal produced more than half of US electricity 25 years ago. That's now down to about 15%. Nuclear and hydro have remained relatively flat. What has picked up the share from coal is gas, wind, and solar, and you see those growing. Last year, carbon-free nuclear, hydro, and renewables produced almost 40% of electricity in the US. That is a significant shift. If you just look at the faint yellow line at the beginning and then off to the right in 2024, that depicts the growth of solar. If you look at capacity additions, which we'll cover here in a bit, almost everything in recent years has been natural gas and wind and solar. What is not depicted here is battery energy storage, which is also playing an increasingly important role, and it's often coupled with renewables, wind and solar projects, and hybrid configurations. Next, we'll look at rates. Louisiana continues to be a leader, continues to have very competitive industrial electric rates. This is the average for the state for 2024 relative to its peers. You see it's the second lowest in the US. You'll also see, if you look at the states that are in the lowest 5 to 10, a common theme. You've got states in the Southeast, but you also have some of the states that I mentioned earlier, notably Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, again, states that have seen industrial sales growth, competitive gas prices, competitive electricity prices. Cover a couple more items. Carbon intensity in the United States and along the Gulf Coast continues to decrease. That's partly the story that we talked about a second ago. You've got legacy fossil fuel plants, coal, and less efficient gas unit steam plants that are being retired, and they're being replaced with more efficient natural gas, as well as zero emission wind, solar, and energy storage coupled with that. Which brings us to the last slide, looking at capacity. This is a projection for just the 4 Gulf Coast states for the next 6 years. Remarkably, it shows an almost doubling of capacity, again, led by investments in gas, renewables, and energy storage. If you're wondering why the numbers are so large relative to Louisiana, it's because this obviously includes Texas. Texas has 6 times the population of Louisiana. You've got population growth there that averages recent years 1 million people a year that are either moving to Texas or being born in Texas. They've also got significant growth, industrial expansions, large-scale data centers as well. Coupled with this are enhancements to processes, for example, that wholesale markets are using to accelerate the addition of resources, given what the US and notably the Gulf Coast states and Louisiana in particular are experiencing, which is rapid load growth driven by industry as well as data centers. To a lesser extent, EVs, a lesser extent, heat pumps, kind of electrification matters. So with that, we'll transition to the next section.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, so now we're going to move to David's section, which is energy manufacturing, which I will cover here. So, as we've done for many years, we track all of the energy manufacturing investments that are happening, and you can see the different categories there. Methanol transition is going to be things like blue ammonia, carbon sequestration projects, and then ammonia, cracker polymer, and LNG export. And so I just want to highlight that this is not a forecast of a big increase. As you've seen throughout the years, of course, you have lots of announcements. Some of those announcements come to fruition, some do not, and some that do come to fruition end up being delayed from the time period that we're looking at. And so having this increase is pretty typical, but it shows that we're going to have robust continued investment moving forward, and there's a lot of activity. 2 years ago, we really started tracking for the first time these what we called energy transition or low carbon based manufacturing investments. And what's really fascinating this year, that share that have this decarbonization component continues to increase. And so last year was about a third. This year we have about 41% of those. And so a lot of these projects are having this low carbon piece of it, which is increasingly important as you're selling these products onto the global market. And then we've got the breakdown of Texas and Louisiana. And, Louisiana is doing really well in terms of our investments relative to our neighbor Texas, which is, of course, much, much larger. And then we've got the numbers here. So between 2012 and 2024, there were approximately $263 billion of investments in refining, chemicals, hydrocarbon export, and energy transition in the Gulf Coast. And then currently there are an additional $273 billion in announcements, about half of which here are in Louisiana. And so we've got really, really robust number of announcements going on right now. And so this is really positive fundamentals for our employment forecasts that are going to come up here in a minute. One thing that we did pull this year, and this is just from LED's data, but we were able to go in and look at every single project currently in LED's database. And we looked at ones that specifically had a mention of some decarbonization components. So whether it's, and in particular for this, carbon sequestration. And we looked at investments with no CCS and then investments with CCS. The thing I want to highlight is completed projects we've had since 2010. Again, this is from the LED data, is about $135 billion. And there were about an announced of 59 billion right now with no CCS component. Historically, there have been a very, very small that have been completed that have a CCS component embedded, significantly less than $1 billion. But you have 45 billion in announcements that have the CCS component. And so again, this has been a big topic of discussion this year. Carbon sequestration. In fact, a lot of communities have had questions about this that Tyler, I'm sure, will opine on here in a minute in the state policy section. And by the way, someone's asking really quickly what we mean by transition. What we really mean is decarbonization, so a low carbon product. And then we've got the share of CO2 emissions from the different parts of the sector. And the thing I really want to highlight here is the Gulf Coast has about a third of our emissions that are industrial emissions relative to 20% nationally. And Louisiana is even more outsized in that way. About 58% of industrial emissions of emissions come from industrial, relative to, again, that 20% nationally. And so when we talk about decarbonization here in Louisiana, what we're really talking about is this industrial decarbonization, as can be seen here. Okay. And with that, we're going to move to energy exports. Again, I've got lots of additional slides on energy exports online, but some of the highlights is refinery utilization continues to be healthy, and we continue to grow our operating capacity. Of course, we had the dip in the pandemic, and now we're growing back. And so the refinery industry is looking pretty good, as well as the crack spreads are healthy relative to historical standards. And so there was also, I'm not going to dig into it too much today, but there was also uncertainty in the last 2 years about the small refinery exemption to the RFS, the renewable fuel standards, that was giving us some questions about how this could impact our small refineries. There have been policy changes that have benefited those small refineries that have removed our kind of question of whether or not perhaps those refineries would move forward. So the refining sector is very is healthy right now. And we can see that with the U.S. refined product trade continuing to expand our export. Of course, LNG exports continue to be healthy. We're now exporting 14% of U.S. natural gas is being exported in the form of LNG, and we continue to see this pattern of growth there. Of course, you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a little dip after, and now we're climbing again. And then you can see here, we've got the top importers of U.S. produced LNG since 2016, a breakdown of the countries. And on the online slide deck, we have really cool schematics of showing the different LNG export facilities and the locations of internationally where that LNG is going. So go check that out. It's a really fun graphic to look at. And finally, Gulf Coast exports to the world, again, continue to remain healthy here. Keep in mind that these are price times quantity. And so when the price is relatively low as it is right now, that influences the value exported relative to the quantity. But again, it just shows that exports continue to be robust. And with that, I'm going to conclude with this section by just showing this of where is the future exports going to go to. So we've got, of course, Europe and North America. Total population is really flatlined, and we're actually having less children are being born than are repopulating Europe and North America. But this is very, very different than you see in North Africa as West Asia, which has seen this rapid growth. And the next phase, of course, is going to be the sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is really the long-term fundamentals of demand growth, which is going to be important for our exports. And with that, we're going to now move into the novel policy implications sector or a section of the GCEO. So we're going to start with our state policies with Tyler. So Tyler, floor is yours. Can you hear us, Tyler?
Good. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Excellent. Well, first, I want to say thank you. I'm excited to be here too and allowing Congressman Graves to participate in this GCEO. It's really been a true honor to get involved with this. So thank you for that. So I want to walk through why these policy shifts matter and why Louisiana feels them faster than most other states. As you see this changing policy landscape, we're in a moment where both federal and state energy policy is shifting faster and with bigger swings than we're used to. When rules move quickly, credits pause, permitting standards change, trade rules shift, it creates uncertainty for long-term capital projects. Now, to the credit of the Landry administration, they really have leaned in on economic development as a stabilizing strategy. They're trying to signal that even if the policy environment at the federal level is volatile, Louisiana wants to remain a place where companies can still invest. But that doesn't erase uncertainty. It just creates pathways to push projects forward instead of waiting on perfect clarity. And so why does Louisiana feel it first? Greg did talk a little bit about the exports. Louisiana feels these swings earlier and harder because our economy is built on exports. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, we shipped 87 billion in goods last year, and most of that is petroleum, chemicals, LNG, and energy-intensive products. And the thing is, Louisiana is one of the only places in the world where you can produce the natural gas molecule, transport it, process it, liquefy it, and export it, all without ever leaving the borders of the state. That full value chain is a competitive advantage, but it also means policy turbulence hits the entire chain at once. So contractors, shift workers, operators see the impact before it ever shows up in the national data. We've already seen companies delay maintenance, revisit timelines, and rethink certain projects because the environment keeps shifting. So at the state level, there's been a lot of movement aimed at positioning Louisiana as competitive, even during this uncertainty. During the last session, we saw oil severance tax on new wells drop to 6.5%. The State Mineral and Energy Board has continued to extend and adjust their royalty reduction program. The industrial tax exemption program timelines have been tightened with an expedited track under Executive Order 25033. And carbon management reforms have changed the consent, oversight, rights of way rules, a lot of the things that the legislature did during the 2025 regular session. Most recently, Governor Landry did issue an executive order temporarily pausing new Class 6 applications as of October 2025. And so, again, that is the permit that's issued under the Underground Injection Control Program delegated to conservation by the EPA, allowing the agency to reorient and prioritize expediting review with the significant leadership changes and all of the things that have happened between the Edwards and the Landry administration. And importantly, the fall 2024 changes to the tax code were enacted, including constitutional amendments that ultimately failed, which resulted in raising revenue from taxes on commercial activity, which must now be balanced against the state's broader economic development strategy. So what you see is a push-pull. The state is trying to modernize and attract investment while also navigating tax changes that increase commercial revenue obligations. It's a balancing act, and it creates friction at the exact moment companies are evaluating where to put that next dollar. So with this level of policy in motion at both the federal and state levels is exactly why structure is so important. And so the setup around Act 458, the new Department of Conservation and Energy, is an attempt to create a stable operating framework so the industry can keep moving, even when everything around it is uncertain. And the details for that are significant and can be found on the website, on the Department of Conservation and Energy's website. There's reports up there and things like that. We have slides that have been included and content of the GCEO, but just know there is a lot more information out there, but it has been a significant part of the state policy changes. And appreciate it, Greg, and happy to answer any questions later in the program.
Thanks, Tyler. And next we'll move to Congressman Graves to talk about what's happening in the federal landscape.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Upton and Tyler. Appreciate your availability today. In regard to the federal government and its policy implications, I think when you look back historically, you have traditionally seen world events have a big impact on energy prices. And so, for example, situations like COVID, situations like instability in the Middle East, and certainly events like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, those type of events have that again I'll categorize as world events have had drastic impact on energy prices globally. What we're seeing now is this new approach, this new trend where you're seeing, and what I'll sort of categorize as domestic discretionary events having large impacts. Over the last 9 years, we've had three presidents inaugurated. We've gone from an Obama administration energy policy to a Trump administration energy policy to a Biden administration energy policy and back to a second Trump administration. So when I refer to the discretionary events, what you've seen is you've seen a Obama administration that had certainly what I would refer to as an all of the above energy approach that did utilize conventional resources like oil, gas, coal, as well as incentivizing the use of renewable energies like solar, wind, and other sources. And then you went to a Trump administration policy that doubled down on conventional fuels. You then saw this wild pendulum swing to a Biden administration that very much established preferences through things like the IIJA legislation that had tens of billions of dollars in incentive and investments into renewable energy, the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, that invested hundreds of billions of dollars influencing these energy markets in ways toward renewable energy like wind and solar. Excuse me. Also other discretionary actions like pausing LNG exports, like effectively pausing offshore lease sales, to then a new Trump administration that has come in and lifting the LNG export ban, doubling and tripling down, as Dr. Upton noted earlier, with the lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico. So you're seeing political events. It's not just a polarization of politics in the United States, but that polarization is actually very much being used in discretionary ways to influence energy markets. And I remind you, the energy industry in the United States, by some estimate, is approaching $2 trillion a year, employing millions and millions of people. So if you're going to have 4 years of energy certainty on trillion-dollar implications in business, it creates real challenges. And so what you're seeing right now under this administration, again, I think it's a return toward conventional fuels. It is a removal through the Big Beautiful Bill Act, a removal or a sunsetting of tax incentive toward renewable energy. You have seen a pause and withdrawal of grants that were announced during the previous administration, incentivizing renewable energy sources, and a much more robust use of regulatory and discretionary actions to preference energy sources that we have not seen historically. So returning back to how I opened, look, we are seeing an increase in demand for electricity for data centers and just general electrification through EVs and other uses. But we are seeing an unprecedented use of ideology or influence by ideology on energy policies that are having profound impacts on energy markets that historically we have only seen through world events. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Upton and look forward to questions and comments.
Thanks, Congressman Graves. So now we're going to go ahead and conclude with our employment forecasts, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So there are lots of great questions coming in right now. If you have any, now's a great time to ask them before we move into it. So let's talk about employment. So this is U.S. upstream oil and gas employment. So we had 650,000 workers before the 2014 price crash. We bottomed out at almost a little over 400,000. We then picked up again before the pandemic to that about 500,000 mark. We saw this decline to about 325,000. And then we saw this climb and then this flatlining. And so U.S. upstream employment within 2025, we estimate we've had about 5,200 jobs lost, and this data will be revised. So this is partially a forecast, but also partially the historical data, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics will revise the data for up to a year after it is released. And so, um, of course, the low price environment, the efficiencies we're talking about is perhaps unsurprising that we've seen a loss in jobs within that sector, despite the fact that that production continues to grow. We are forecasting that with especially oil a little bit in contango right now, prices a little bit upward pressure as well as the production robust and continue to be strong. We're estimating that we'll gain some of those back, but not quite all of them at the national level over the next year, and then it'll be flat thereafter. For Louisiana, we've lost about 1,000 jobs. Again, this is the estimate right now, 2025. We estimate we're going to gain about 500 of those back in 26 for the same reasons that we talked about, and then have a flat after that. So again, the story here is one of technological advancement. It's one of relatively low prices, and we just don't see the employment returning back to the pre-pandemic time period or pre-2014 price crash. But we hope that we'll continue to see kind of stability here, if not these large fluctuations that we have seen in the past. And this shows you the forecast for the last few years. I want to note that revisions were significantly downward this last year. So based on our forecast last year, we had flatlined, and we were again projecting a little bit of stability there. Data's come in significantly below what that forecast was, and you can see the same thing with 2023. Again, those downward revisions, and so flat employment within the Louisiana upstream sector. Texas, you can see a similar story, but you still see more of that boom bust cycle. In 2025, they've lost about 1,300 jobs, or about 0.6% of jobs lost. We're forecasting, again, a little bit of a gain of maybe 2% in 26. A lot of this is because the Texas is more sensitive to those fluctuations because of that shale production compared to a lot of our exposure to the offshore. Of course, we still have the Haynesvilles we talked about, but our relative share of exposure to the offshore has been more so. And this shows you the forecast for the last few years with Texas, and kind of what that looks like. Okay. So the thing I want to highlight here is that for years we had the share of total employment within upstream. So this is the share in Louisiana, compared to Texas plus Louisiana, or really the entire Gulf Coast has been declining. Then we actually saw this little pickup during the pandemic, meaning that we lost less jobs on a relative basis. And a lot of that we attributed to, again, that stability of offshore versus shale. But that trend has actually reversed itself over the last few years. And so, again, we continue to see, again, the efficiencies are wonderful. They're great. I think a lot of those efficiencies offshore, even increasingly so. And so that share of, again, the total employment pie has been shrinking for Louisiana. And when we look at the Dallas Federal Reserve survey, they've got a business activity index and a company outlook index. As you can see, they're kind of flat, slightly negative, and I'm gonna say is gonna be consistent with the many folks from industry that I spoke with. On refining and chemical, we've seen we're estimating in 2025 480 jobs gained, or about 1.2%. 26, 27, 28. Where again, we're going to forecast some growth. We've significantly we've downgraded our growth forecast from last year. And I'm going to tell you the big thing that we've heard about a lot is, of course, in Q1 it was the economic uncertainties. People are feeling a little bit better about the fundamentals. High interest rates have been cited of selling into markets such as auto and homes, with interest rates being higher. But the thing that a lot of folks have also cited is these trade uncertainties we talked about, and really impacting those longer term investments while we wait for this uncertainty to be resolved. And you can see our forecast the last few years, again, still positive, but downgraded from last year. And then Texas refining chemicals, 2024 we estimate, 2025 we estimate about 1% job gain. And again, job gains over the next 2 years, but a little bit more flat and less optimistic than last year. And you can see how our employment forecasts compare right there. So with that, I want to conclude with a graph that's kind of a classic that we show every year. Louisiana has more exposure to that refining and chemicals today than we do to the upstream. And that's very different than Texas, that is still very much has that upstream presence. Again, of course, both sectors are larger in Texas. It's a significantly larger state, larger economy, but the relative share has been very important. The other thing I want to note here, and we show these multipliers every year. So this is the number of indirect jobs relative to the direct jobs within that sector, and that's really important to think about because it's not always clear whether a company would employ someone directly to do some activity or whether they would hire a contractor in order to do that same activity. And I actually pulled the data from 5 years ago compared to today on these multipliers. And what you've actually seen, really interestingly, it's been across all of these, both upstream oil and gas and manufacturing, is that refining and chemical manufacturing, is that the number of indirect jobs to direct jobs has grown. And so if you look 5 years ago for oil and gas extraction, for instance, it was about 3.4. Now it's 4.8. For refining, for instance, it was 4.6 5 years ago, and now you see it's 7.2. For chemicals, 4.9 versus 5.3. And so, really always keep that in mind when you're looking at those employment forecasts for the direct, that we're actually seeing more of these indirect jobs, which is really a kind of positive nuance as we again see these efficiency gains and these expansions. So with that, I'm going to conclude. Export activity continues to drive investment across the energy value chain. Oil and gas production continues to expand, but what is driving that expansion is those efficiency gains. Natural gas prices continue to remain low in the Gulf Coast relative to the world, which is really a big driver of these industrial expansions, as well as the LNG projects, and which, by the way, is true for oil as well, but to a lesser extent than for gas, which is a very large difference. Electricity markets, we're watching maybe undergoing this inflection point with a new era of electric demand growth. Perhaps this future is going to see rapid electrification, and there's many wide estimates of how rapid that electrification is going to be. So this is going to be something over the next year we're watching really closely. It's going to be really interesting to see. Refined product exports remain robust and crack spreads are healthy. And although the fundamentals are solid here with the long-term economic growth and all these other kind of fundamentals that we're talking about, again, it's that policy uncertainty that was cited as our key concern from stakeholders this year. So with that, we're going to conclude the outlook itself, and we've got a few minutes here for Q&A. So I've got lots of great questions here. I'm going to try to go through them and give them to the appropriate people. And so this one's for you, Congressman Graves, and I'm curious to hear your standpoint on this. How do you see, we talk about policy uncertainty, and we talk about the changes at the federal level, but how do you see this influencing in the short run specific communities and the jobs within those communities? Do you see these as longer term kind of big picture things that a community might, well, okay, that's fine? Or do you really see this impacting these people in these communities today? What's your perspective on that?
Greg, it's a great question, and I noted earlier about the gravity of this. Again, these ideological decisions that are having an influence. I think that areas that have strong fundamentals or availability of natural resources, I think that the durability of those areas is going to be, meaning the durability of the ability to survive or weather the storm is going to be much greater than those that have come in and perhaps temporarily invested in what you referred to earlier as an energy transition. But the bottom line is that the more that federal policymakers can make policies that are less what I'll refer to as polarizing and more so based upon complementary decisions based on the fundamentals or availability of resources in the United States, I think it's going to be much better. And let me just put one little example there. Right now, renewable energy is largely dependent upon critical minerals from China. China has decided in trade negotiations to use that as leverage against the United States, therefore using a tool that we don't have control over. So the more so the decisions are made based upon resources that we have in the United States and have less I guess, pendulum swings as a result of other countries' decisions, I think the better it's going to be for the United States.
Interesting. So here's a follow-up on that, and I'm going to kick this to you, Congressman Graves, as well as you, Andrew. But there's several questions about AI and in particular China. So question number one, is China kicking our butt, so to speak, with AI? Or is that the case? Or is, we've got, as highlighted in the outlook, a lot of these investments are really happening right now. Of course, we've talked about Meta, but Texas has a lot going on too, which is part number one. And then part number two, is the availability of electricity going to be that Achilles heel, if you will, that could limit our ability in order to compete in that global AI marketplace? So y'all can both, opine in whatever order makes sense.
Garrett, do you want to go first? I think more of the question is weighted to you, and then
Sure.
if there's a need, I can cover kind of the
Yeah.
supply side.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So, look, there are three key things that are involved, sort of metrics or factors that are involved in AI in terms of who's winning. And I think it comes down one into computing power, two it comes into data, and number three it's about energy. And so, if we were to take those three, computing power, I think that it's pretty clear that metrics have established that the United States has better computing power. We do have right now better technology. Number two is data, and that means a couple of different things. It means the speed or access to data. It means that things like dial-up modems aren't really options. You've got to have the access to fiber to the fastest data in order to really facilitate or process that data at your data centers. The United States right now is still largely in an advantageous position, but there are some networking technologies that China's advancing that is allowing them to begin catching up. And then the third one that I think you're probably most interested in is energy or electricity. And there's no question that when you look at sort of the rules of the game that China is using versus the United States, China does not generally have the same arduous permitting process, doesn't have the same sensitivity to the environment, private property rights, and things along those lines. And so I do not think that the United States will be able to maintain or really even has an edge there right now compared to China. So, in summary, I think that it's safe to say that the United States at this time is in a better position with technology, with large language models and others. But I do think that unless we take some very aggressive efforts, particularly on the energy and on the regulatory side, the United States will not be able to maintain a competitive advantage.
Interesting.
So one of the things, just Garrett, maybe to add, is the differential in speed between constructing a data center and constructing generation and transmission infrastructure. And that's really the issue. The gap is, a Meta or a Google or another developer can construct a data center in 2 years. You're building a building, you're building servers. Obviously, they have equipment, supply chain type constraints, but you're constructing something that is not complicated necessarily to construct. On the other hand, you just said it, generation, transmission, you have permitting timelines, you've got regulatory approvals, you've got availability of critical elements like transformers, of gas turbines that are affecting supply side. You have wholesale markets that are trying to adjust and enhance their interconnection processes and study methods to try to catch up in speed. There's ways you can address it from a ramping perspective. The data center doesn't use 100% of what it needs, and maybe, and then initially it phases in. So there's a variety of accommodations, but it isn't a simple silver bullet type situation. And the scale, again, I'll just emphasize, is completely different. When somebody's constructing a refinery from scratch, which hasn't happened in the US in, I don't know, 30 plus years, if not longer, you have a long timeline to do that. The utility can plan accordingly. You can construct things to meet their timeline. When a data center says I can come up and add 1,000 megawatts to the transmission grid in 24 months out of nowhere, that just is not the way things have traditionally worked. And so you're having to make adjustments on a lot of different ways to try to accommodate that.
So, Andrew, on that point, there's a question on nuclear energy, and I think the timing is a piece of it there. So, of course,
Yeah.
with nuclear energy, we have cost, which is a consideration. You also have timing, but you also have some of these, tech companies have really made these aggressive decarbonization commitments.
Right.
I know here in Louisiana, we can see from the public filing that it's primarily, combined cycle natural gas that's going to be powering that data center, so to speak. What's your thought on nuclear? And I know we're doing a nuclear strategic framework with the department as well.
Right.
And so if Tyler, if you want to comment on that, you're welcome to as
Yeah,
well.
I mean, there's the challenge there. If you're talking about large scale AP 1000 Westinghouse type projects, you've got a timeline of a decade or more from start to finish, if not longer, depending on what happens constructing that. If you're talking SMRs, there's a lot of interest and money getting thrown at small modular reactors. But the reality is you're not going to see deployment in the US for a few more years, and those are going to be the first sites. The utility industry, my former employer, is going to have a level of just conservatism as far as adopting that type of technology. They're going to want to see it commercially proven, the costs come down, the certainty increased. So you're really looking at maybe the early 2030s where you're going to, assuming SMRs really take off, you start to see deployment. That's not going to meet the timeline for many of the data centers that are on the drawing boards in the next 24 to 48 months.
Interesting.
And Greg, I think Andrew is spot on with all of the assessments and the time that it takes to make those capital investments, construct and operate. There's also a lot of discussion around the regulatory structure for that, especially at the state level. But I mean, you mentioned the strategic plan that's coming through LED. It all sounds great, and I hope it all works out. It's just there's a lot of layers to actually building, completing, powering those facilities themselves. So it's going to take some time.
So I'm going to pivot here and ask something that we're all going to love to talk about, which is coastal lawsuits. Of course, we had reform that went through the legislature last session. Chris, I'll start with you. What are you hearing from phone calls? Are people saying, "Oh my gosh, this is less of an issue now"? Concerns about legacy lawsuits, about coastal lawsuits, and then Tyler, from your former department's perspective, kind of what your thoughts on that as well.
Well, Greg, if you look at the data, in say 2013, there were 25 barge rigs operating in coastal Louisiana. By 2015, that was down to about 5, and it's never gotten above that level again. Two things happened in almost immediate association with each other, unrelated. Coastal lawsuits were filed in 2013, and the price crashed in 2015. So it's very difficult to say what was the cause. We do know that several large independents appear to have left the state. Several majors that were still operating in the coastal zone have left. You cannot say what their motivation was. So I'm hearing that it's just a general concern for the business environment, but I don't know that there's a specific case where somebody has or has not operated because of them. The one effect of both of those is that the number of available barge rigs, which are necessary to operate in the coastal zone, is now maybe 3 or 4. They've actually left the area, and so a significant ramp up is going to be challenging. If it were to come back, there'll be a question of rig availability there.
Interesting. And Tyler, do you have any thoughts on it from this last legislative session, and what your thoughts are on there?
So it's an incredibly difficult concept and matter to manage. The hardest, not pun unintended, but it's there are legacy operations in the state that are not all equal, and so that becomes part of that challenge. I will say that from a structural standpoint, we did think through those things from an enforcement, permitting, compliance standpoint, so that way the agency could be more consistent. It had the tools to be consistent, because not every operator is the same. There are operators that no longer exist that were more, may have made decisions differently than ones that, are prudent with their operations and things like that. So a lot of the structural work we did was in response to those lawsuits, right, to be more effective in the way that the full value chain from the original permit all the way to the decommissioning of the asset. I mean, that's one of the hardest things to understand from an oil and gas perspective is it doesn't, a well could operate over 100 years. So it extends beyond individual terms of service and people. It goes through a multi-generational regulatory requirements and structure. And so things have changed over those 100 years. And so, how those lawsuits are, impacting the operations today, I can tell you that it's not the wells that have been sued on, it's the wells where they have not. That's created almost sort of like a standstill approach where because of the uncertainty from the lawsuits, there's a lot of concern around re-entering, plugging, closing wells, especially ones that have been in the chain of operatorship that are related to the lawsuits.
Interesting. So I've got another question here on CCS, hitting all the controversial topics here. I haven't listened to it, but apparently Secretary Burgum was on Moon Griffon yesterday, who made some comments about the Trump administration's perspective on carbon sequestration and permanent sequestration in particular. Of course, we had the moratorium from the Landry administration that temporarily paused while local communities had had an ability to opine on this. So from Congressman Graves and Secretary Gray, from kind of y'all's federal state hat, I mean, just being candid here, are you seeing a pivot, or are you seeing a movement away from CCS? Or are you seeing no, these that this decarbonization, and if the global customers want these low carbon products, we're going to be able to provide those, and we're going to provide the regulatory framework to allow for private actors to do that if they choose to. What is your perspective here?
I was actually with Secretary Burgum and Deputy Secretary and others at the Department of Interior yesterday after the comments were made. And look, I certainly don't speak for them, but I will say that some of the folks tried to kind of clarify the comments a little bit. And let me back up. I want to remind you, 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act was the initial incentive known as 45Q for carbon capture and storage. That was done during the first Trump administration. There was an enhancement of those tax credits, particularly for direct air capture, that were done during the Biden administration. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the initial incentives were put in place during the first Trump administration. This is where I'm going to kind of go into a little bit of discretionary, my personal opinion. I think, we've talked a lot about these, or I have anyway, these pendulum swings of politics and how you have this discretionary polarization that's occurring that's impacting markets. I think the two boxes that you check that sort of ensure durability through the different ideological administrations or Congress changes and majorities is when you find solutions that are both economically sustainable and environmentally sustainable. To the extent that CCS is a solution such as EOR, enhanced oil recovery, where you're actually getting a benefit, to the extent that you find inexpensive ways of sequestering, I think that this is absolutely a long-term durable technology that will survive different administrations. I don't think that comments that sort of say this is great, this is awful, really provides the type of certainty that's conducive to investments in those areas. And so I do know that there are some people that are working to try to get some clarification publicly out of the administration, just helping to provide a little bit better certainty for investments that are on the horizon.
Just to, echo a lot of what Congressman Graves mentioned. I mean, because it's such a challenging topic and has been recently, especially in being a polarizing, discussion point, it words can be taken out of context. And it's unfortunately that you have to sort of stand back and try to interpret what was said. But, people, words mean something. So when things are said and they're interpreted in a particular way, they can have a trickle down effect that, it is polar. There's no question about it. Right. And I mean, I think Congressman Graves covered it well on the way that these policies have been created through a polarizing nature, and it's a huge opportunity for Louisiana, in my opinion, from an economic standpoint. I mean, you look at, you know, there's a demand for the product, which is why they're trying to construct the value chain as such. It's not, when I was working in previous roles, I would always say, I don't take the gasoline home with me, right? It's because somebody buys it. And so if it's a market driven decision, whether there's a credit supplementing that from an innovation standpoint is irrelevant. If there's someone to buy it and they're going to make it, they should let them sell it. And so it's an opportunity that I think Louisiana should capitalize on. And, but unfortunately politics get involved, and we just have to deal with it as such.
Awesome. Thanks. So there's a question about immigration policy and if that's impacting the availability of workers. I don't have a definitive answer, of course. None of the conversations with industry I had, folks cited that specifically. I didn't ask about it either, though, but that was never something that came up with my conversations. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Has anyone heard that as being a constraint for industry, immigration policies impacting the availability of workers? No? Okay. And then, oh, go on.
So the one thing I wanted to say is you are dealing from a petrochemical side with a highly trained workforce that requires safety, and so a lot of those things, it's not necessarily it's not the same as an agricultural group, or that may have this sort of seasonal migrant workers that come through and impact labor force. They're going to have a well-trained, consistent workforce that's constantly being filtered and hired. So I would be surprised that if it would.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, and then we'll kind of close with this last question. It's a good one. So, and this is something I actually heard Secretary Chris Wright talk about last week at the National Petroleum Council meeting in DC, which was this concern of exporting to the world. And is that going to raise domestic prices? And so, in theory, of course, you've got supply and demand come together. If you shift demand to the right by opening up to this global market price, in theory, this could put upward pressure on prices. Of course, what we've just shown today is we've had, record production within the United States. Our exports continue to expand, and yet we're kind of still in this low price environment. And one of the things that Secretary Wright said I thought was really interesting was kind of the connection of geopolitics and energy, of being this supplier of energy to the world. And by supplying that energy to the world, you're able to be this partner, and it can mitigate a lot of these geopolitical currents, such as the ups and downs we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For instance, also allows you to supply that to spread that supply more broadly, again, to impact that global volatility of it. And so I'm curious to hear folks' thoughts on that. Maybe Chris, from your perspective, Andrew, from your perspective, and then of course Congressman Graves and Tyler. Kind of, what are y'all thinking about that? Is that something you're hearing about? Do you have this as a concern of, hey, by exporting these products, we're not gonna, it's gonna pull that price up, and we're not gonna have the product at a low cost here in the United States? So anyone can kind of hop on that. And this will also be, we have just a few minutes left. If you want to tie this in any closing thoughts you have, you're welcome to do that as well.
So Greg, if you think of power supply, Louisiana, the majority of power in Louisiana is generated with natural gas. And obviously natural gas prices directly influence the rates that consumers and industry pay. And so to the extent that you have low natural gas prices like you've had in, say, 2023 and 2024, you've got a direct correlation to lower electricity rates. Gas prices are trending higher. They're over $4 in MMBTU in this winter timeframe we're in. That's going to translate to slightly higher electricity prices. You saw that in a major way in 2022 when Ukraine was invaded. You saw a direct, very quick, within 60-day correlation to higher electricity bills, coupled with, unfortunately, a very hot summer, which had agitated consumers and lots of consequences. So that's where it relates to the power markets. As it relates to other things, I'll defer to Chris and others to have an opinion.
Greg, just from the oil and gas perspective, I'd go back to the old adage: we've been running out of oil and gas since it was first discovered. I mean, what we talked about in terms of technological advances, particularly the 20,000 psi technology, is allowing us to produce oil hydrocarbons that were not previously accessible. So, as the supply can be affected by technology, and I suspect it will be.
Look, I think first of all, I want to do a little end zone dance here. How amazing is it that you look at this transformation in markets? You went from a situation where the Gulf Coast was planning on importing LNG to being the largest exporter of LNG in the world in terms of the region. You heard Dr. Upton mention the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You had the majority of the European Union that was dependent upon Russia for gas sources. You have seen them largely begin migrating away from Russia. The Gulf Coast has stepped in to fill that void. So, I mean, I think this has been an amazing success story under relatively stable prices as a result of the agility of the United States to make some profound changes. Now, look, when you look at the volumes of energy that we have stepped in and supplanted, it is absolutely remarkable. I think that we need to remain sensitive to the prices and what we're doing with exports. But that is why it is so important. And I made mention of critical minerals earlier. If we're going to move in a renewable energy direction, ensuring that we have a compatible critical mineral strategy. Similarly, if we are going to remain a massive exporter of conventional fuels, we must ensure that we have an upstream strategy that is compatible with that policy decision. So what that means is ensuring you have lease sales, ensuring that you have predictability or certainty for long-term energy investment decisions, and continuing to monitor prices, especially in an area like Louisiana or the Gulf Coast that has such a high concentration of industrial energy use.
All right, Tyler, you have the last word.
Yeah. Uh, you know, I think that one of the challenges that come with natural gas in general is that an advocacy strategy can result in the prices declining because people invest in more wells. That was actually what Aubrey McLindon went through when he was dealing and creating Chesapeake in the early in the 90s and into the 2000s. And don't forget that at one point there was an expectation that we would be importing LNG, right? And so I think that from a reserve standpoint, this is off the top of my head, but I think it's around 458 trillion cubic feet is what they expect is in the Haynesville Shale. And so when the prices start to trickle up, they drill more. And that's just until that supply is truly restricted from a domestic standpoint and without accounting for innovation at this point, which is something that has a huge impact on the production numbers. I don't see how it could get too high without some sort of increased activity on the upstream side, especially based on the amount of resources that we have just in Louisiana, not counting Pennsylvania and the Eagle Ford or any other places throughout the country. So I think that the demand will be here, continue to drive, investment in those pipelines and production and whatnot, and continue to be a true and great resource for operating here in the state.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank all of us who contributed to the report. This was really fun to work on with you guys. I want to thank all the people that participated today. We have many questions we didn't get to. I tried to tie them together as much as I could. But thank you again, and everyone have a wonderful day.